Good morning, everyone. We might just kick off there. I know there's still people coming in, but I'm conscious we have a lot to get through this morning. So you're all very welcome this morning. My name is Mia Frawley, the Director of People, Operations and Governance here in Cork Chamber. And it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to you today for our HR Barometer Report, Unleashing the Strategic Role of HR to Drive Your Business and People Potential. This event is proudly brought to you through a partnership between Cork Chamber and Adare Trusted People Partners. I guess this is timely as we approach the end of the year and planning for next year. Adare and Cork Chamber are committed to supporting businesses and fostering excellence. So we'll be covering a wide range of topics today designed to inform your planning, particularly for 2026. We'll look at key findings from the report. We'll highlight emerging trends and challenges and share practical insights into and considerations, I guess, to help guide your organisation priorities for 2026. Thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to an insightful session. Before I pass you over, just some housekeeping. If you can just ensure your mics remain off. We are recording the event for our own records, so you probably should have got a pop-up by now. And look, we do have a lot to get through this morning, so if you have any questions, if you can pop them into the chat box, and we'll come back to your queries individually then after the event this morning. I'd love to hand you over now to Michelle McDonough, who's the Chief Client Officer for Adare. Thank you, and I'll chat to you all later.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Niamh, for that introduction. And you're all very welcome to the launch of Adare's HR Barometer Report for the Munster region. So we're delighted to be with you this morning. My name is Michelle McDonough, and I'm the Chief Client Officer with Adare Trusted People Partners. And we're pleased to have so many businesses in the room virtually with us today attending our event. And we'll be joined shortly by my colleagues, Amanda Finnegan, Head of Organisational Design and Development, and Katie Ridge, Head of Employer Relations, who will bring you through the findings of our report. As Niamh said, we have a full agenda for this morning, so we're delighted to share with you the latest findings. And this is our barometer, our HR Barometer Series 9.2. And our barometer is in its 9th year of publication. And over that time, we've found the strategic HR landscape, as you all well know, has remained in constant flux. And through our data, we seek to support you in responding to those changing employee and customer expectations. So we began to run the HR Barometer twice per year from 2021 or since 2021, and that was in response to that increasing pace of change and the need for us as HR professionals to have very frequent data points and data sets to help guide our decision making and support our strategic role in leading and influencing our organizations. So the HR report is a result of extensive research that's conducted by my colleagues in Adare, surveying hundreds of HR practitioners around the country in all different industries, and the data related to over 73,000 employees in this particular report. And so today, taking stock of the emerging trends, the key data, the forecasts will help you in leading out on your HR strategies, constantly remaining agile. So in terms of our running order today, I'll just take you through our agenda. So Amanda Finnegan is going to begin by taking us through the key HR priorities and metrics for 2025 and 2026, as well as detailing the trends and insights stemming from our research. Katie Ridge is going to take you through the findings related to performance management, retirement, pensions, and workforce practices. And I'll deliver then the key findings on diversity and inclusion and pay, and discuss with you the shifts that we're anticipating influencing this area in the months to come. So before we get into the data, it's always important for us to take an initial step back and look at the macro impacts that are influencing sectoral and industry decisions. And we've seen a lot of volatility in the market that we're obviously struggling, or we're constantly, I suppose, challenging ourselves to stay abreast of and respond to. And Ireland's economy is continuing to show signs of strength, but also signs of moderation and rising external risk. The labour market has been steady, but it is expected to grow in 2026, albeit modestly. And we see increasing pressure on costs with budget developments recently confirming minimum wage will increase again in January of next year to 14.15 per hour. And ultimately, we've seen wage growth outpacing inflation for 3 consecutive years. So that's continuing to place those pressures on businesses. In terms of skills, capacity, and forecasting, we see a demand for highly skilled talent continuing to outstrip supply. And that, coupled with aging demographics and underdeveloped succession planning, poses long-term skills and capability risks. So flexibility, transparency, purpose, and personalized career paths have become non-negotiable drivers for attracting and retaining that talent pipeline. And employers are facing continued pressure from younger generations in our workforces to be also having a lens on delivering a strong employee experience and meaningful EVPs at the same time. From a productivity and effectiveness perspective, our data is telling us that organizations remain unprepared to manage operational, financial, and compliance requirements, of which we know there are many coming at us, and we're trying to keep on top of those. And we are seeing declines in employee engagement, collegiality, and innovation, and that's driving perhaps a shift to more office attendance than we've seen in previous reports. In 2026, in terms of looking ahead, we know that tightening regulations and transparency requirements with an implementation deadline of June 2026, and Ireland's gender pay gap reporting thresholds will require HR leaders to proactively address equity, communication, and compliance readiness. So, in summary, the main theme from our report today points to employers adopting integrated, data driven workforce strategies that combine a focus on talent acquisition, retention, skills development, and regulatory readiness. Success, as we know, depends on the whole business approach, and it's about aligning our HR strategies with our organizational transformations, supported by financial planning and evolving employee expectations. So I'll hand over now to my colleagues to present the findings of our HR Barometer report. So sit back, relax, and we'd encourage you to bring some of this data back to your organizations to take some notes and share them with your colleagues over a coffee when you get back into the main office. And hopefully it will inform your strategic decisions for the remainder of 2025 and into 2026. So I'll hand to Amanda. Thank you, Amanda.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to be sharing some of these data points. As Michelle mentioned, we're going to be looking at HR priorities, and you'll be seeing that shift from optimizing what we have to mitigating really the skill scarcity and challenges in our unique business contexts. So let's look at the HR top priorities for our businesses in 2026. As you look at these slides, you'll see that there are blue data points, and these will be indicating the Munster region data, as we've retained the national data for your comparison. I think it's always lovely to see that. When we look at the top priorities, we find that there's an interplay between economic uncertainty, this evolving and younger workforce expectations, and a tight skills availability continues to drive the HR agenda and focus. So traditional and annual planning cycles no longer are fit for purpose. We can see that organizations are placing talent retention and highest priority in the Republic, and in Munster, respectively, you'll see it's 41.7 for nationally and 46.4 for Munster. Given the macroeconomic volatility, AI-driven disruption, the new regulatory pressures, business require dynamic workforce modeling and scenario-based capacity planning to really ensure resilience and agility. A fundamental output for progressive retention strategies as an engaged workforce and an employee experience that adds to your employer value proposition. And so employee engagement and experience is a top priority for almost 4 out of 10 organizations, 39.3% in Munster. And this has been a shifting approach and focus over the last 4 years, denoting a comparison to shifting market demands. And what emerges for the upcoming year is tailored engagement programs that drive the connection of purpose to productivity. and it's underpinned by transitional skills capabilities. Employment levels in Ireland have increased to 2.81 million, and that's an increase of approximately 2.4% over Q2 in 2024. And the continued growth in our labour market and critical skills is reflected in us prioritising talent acquisition, which in Munster is the second highest priority at 42.9%. Despite the moderate economic headwinds, the competitive high value talent remains intense. So that competition against our competitors is huge. So how do we get that? Talent acquisition and its interplay with employee engagement and experience have prompted businesses to reevaluate their value propositions, taking account for the shift in employee demographics and expectations. As leaders for the next 12 months, the focus will need to be on striking a balance between the progress of our businesses and that of the required employment level. Our employment market remains structurally tight, with wage pressures, cost of living impacts, the EU-wide policy changes, including AI regulations, pay transparency directives, the green skills mandates. All of these are influencing both supply and demand. Our role in HR is not operational, it's strategic, directly shaping businesses' competitiveness. You would have noticed the fourth priority is performance management prioritization. In Munster, this is 25%, which we view as an essential alignment and engagement tool. My colleague Katie Ridge will share more about this in depth later. Organizational development, and that is the planned strategic effort to improve organizational effectiveness and health. It focuses on aligning strategy with structure and people and processes, and it uses behavioral sciences and change management. All of that came at 19.4% as a strategic priority for the nationally, but within Munster, it's 7.1%. Now, organizational development can bring value through improved performance and productivity, enhanced employee engagement, stronger relationship and culture and leadership, among some of its benefits. And this might be an area of opportunity for your organization. So what are our recommendations for the top priorities? It looks like redesigning employee value propositions that move beyond salary and benefit to offer personalized growth plans and engagement plans. Developing transparent skills-based progress models where you will give employees clarity on growth opportunities and future forecasting and continuing contingency plans for the multiple macroeconomic and technological outcomes rather than relying on static forecasts. With all the priorities that we've just explored, let's look at the key markers for our progress, and that's what we use our metrics for. But before we move there, let's just make sure that we use the results of this entire barometer that we share with you today, not just for your organization, but for those specific departments that might be keeping you up at night. Please use these as a cornerstone just to do that, to pause, to consider actions, and then steadily implement them as you move forward. So as we look at the HR metrics, make sure that we use them more than just reporting and observing. Let's understand the root causes. Let's use that data to forecast what we can expect and to provide recommendations for our businesses or those specific departments. So the latest benchmark indicate that employee turnover is reaching 12.1% in 2025, with a slight reduction from the previous year, which was 13.7%. The anticipated turnover for 2026 is coming in at 9.9% in Munster, which is a significant drop, likely representing the shifting economic realities for us all. As reported in the HR Barometer 9.1, which was earlier this year, the cost replacing employees has risen to €10,125 per individual. So investment in retention strategies against the current backdrop of rising employment rates is fundamental for the next year. As employees continue to prioritize career growth, flexibility, purpose, Retention strategies should be highlighted for key areas, demonstrating workforce plans that balance employee expectations with our business needs. In 2024, it was reported that one HR resource is required for 67 full-time equivalent employees. In 2025, it's moved and remained at one HR resource for every 83 full-time equivalent employees. And so it is a concerning gap in the increase of workforce complexity and regulatory change. So based on this higher ratio, it's not surprising that you'll see that almost 1 in 4, so 25% of organizations are planning to increase their HR headcount in 2026 by 23%, which is demonstrating of the closing that widening gap of HR skills needed currently in organizations. The planned increase of overall employee headcount is lower than previous years, moving from 67% in 2023 to 62% in 2024, and further reducing to 57% of the survey participants in 2025, indicating the increase of their headcounts in the upcoming year. Of those intending to increase their headcounts, the percentage increase is a nominal 9%. Potentially influenced by the current labor market and the economic landscape. What are the implications? The increased HR to full-time equivalent ratios signal the elevated demand for HR leaders to deliver not just the operational excellence, but strategic workforce insights and long-term planning. While the 25% increase in HR roles is expected, it will also be prudent for organizations to ensure the metrics are established in the business to match the intent. Analytical maturity will define competitive advantage in talent retention, acquisition, engagement, and management. Retrospective reporting will limit agility in this area, and organizations relying solely on backward-looking descriptive analysis risk missing early data signals for attrition, burnout, and future skill gaps. If businesses want to grow a headcount and expand HR resources, but will, without predictive modeling, risk the over or under hiring increases, creating financial inefficiencies and potential skills mismatches, furthering the disconnect between strategy and measurement. So you would have heard a lot of people analytics is required. And so we ask, how would you rate your organization's HR analytical maturity? So looking specifically at the Munster data, most businesses, 64% of those surveyed, will still primarily rely on the descriptive analytics or reporting, which include lagging indicators such as headcount, turnover, cost per hire, rather than the diagnostic, predictive or prescriptive analytics. 1 in 5, so 22% of the survey respondents, seek to understand the root cause through diagnostic analytics, while those forecasting trends is significantly lower at 7% using predictive analytics and 7% using prescriptive analytics to draw out recommendations or automated actions. Even where analytics are used, they are predominantly reviewing it quarterly, so 35% of the survey participants, and annually most 1 in 3, so 29% of organizations are limiting the ability of HR to react in real time with emerging trends, attrition risks, and productivity insights. The biggest barriers to the more advanced use of people analytics are the organization's technologies and tools limitations, which you see at 39%, followed closely by the skills and capability gaps at 54%, and data-related challenges at 36%. A combination of high but decreasing turnover, planned HR headcount expansion, and the underutilization of advanced analytics present both a risk and an opportunity for Irish businesses in the year ahead. One that is managed could be a differentiator in your organizations. So our recommendation is addressing employee turnovers over strategically, so developing early warning attrition models that are essential going ahead, redefining your HR capability and capacity, and implementing real-time analytical dashboards that enable faster, data-driven decision-making that will also assist in building your HR capability in workforce planning and upskilling HR business partners in scenario modeling, productivity analytics, and advanced forecasting tools. When we move on to our next topic, which is learning and development, we see in Ireland, this is at an inflection point. After years of inconsistent investment patterns, organizations are recognizing that the skills capability is now directly tied to business resilience and competitive advantage. However, learning development maturity remains uneven across employees, demonstrable investment volatility over the recorded HR barometer since 2022. The L&D spend as a percentage of payroll remained low in 2025 and coming in at 2.5% in Munster, resulting in an average 4 days of training per employee, which is less than the national by 2 days. But employees forecast it's increased to 3.8%, the investment. I think the stop-start funding model undermines a sustainable capability building. What's important for the upcoming years is a consistent application and the link to skills forecasting and measuring successes. The top priorities in L&D is continuous learning and, not surprising, the upskilling and reskilling for the future. When we ask organizations what was their organizational specific learning and development initiatives that they were planning to implement, it was e-learning models provided by internal staff, provided by external agencies, a massive increase in the use of AI and ChatGPT, doubling that in fact, and mentorship and coaching programs. When we look at the return on investment, 11% of organizations measure it. If we move on to that, we'll see that amongst those who do, the metrics that are demonstrated look at engagement and knowledge and skills retention, 67%, and the retention and transferability of that training, both at 33%. An opportunity for improvement in the coming years is linking learning and development, return on investment, with productivity. Of the 1 in 3 who currently measure productivity as an outcome of learning, 4% increase in productivity has been cited through measuring return on investment in learning and development. So productivity measures in your industry might look different. In manufacturing, you might be looking out for input per labor hour or overall equipment efficiency, cycle time, scrape rate, inventory turnover. If we're looking at retail, we're looking at sales per employee, revenue per square foot. We're looking at customer conversion rate. Technology, we'd be looking at lines of code per developer or feature delivery rate or bug resolution time. And in finance, revenue per employee, customer acquisition cost, or in education, that student to teacher ratio, graduation rates, standardized test scores. But we need to be looking for productivity that says our learning and development investment is actually making a return. So if we haven't got that into our high level of measurement of success of learning, I really want to encourage you so that you can see value and impact from the investment that you're making. And lastly, one of the big things that we've noticed is successions linked to learning and development. The unknown and known disruptors of the future for the macro drivers for change include the current and future skills shortage, digital transformation, the new AI-driven business models, and creating this unprecedented pressure on employers to reskill and upskill workforces quickly. So in order to prepare for this, it's also important to link succession planning with learning and development strategies. The data, however, shows only 50% have no formal succession strategies in place. 11% are having enterprise-wide application in place. 36% are having succession plans for leadership roles only. 31% of our survey participants state that they have full visibility of succession readiness for critical roles. 5 in 10, so 54% have partial visibility, and 15% have no formal tracking of succession readiness of the critical roles, which is a massive opportunity for those organizations. When it comes to evaluation and metrics of success strategies, the top 3 include successor readiness at 39, a percentage of the critical roles filled internally, and the promotion or the internal mobility at 20%. Survey participants also highlighted that the top challenges for a robust succession pipeline, which is important to identify in order to resolve and adapt the upcoming year, those were 61% of the lack of strategic workforce planning is the inconsistent processes across the departments as their top challenges, so the strategic workforce planning not being available and then not making a consistent process available. In our labor market, which is one of the tightest in Europe, the pace of technology disruption is accelerating. Without scalable, measurable, and business-aligned learning and development strategies, our organizations risk capability gaps that directly impact their competitiveness in 2026 and beyond. Our recommendation is to link your learning and development investments to future forecasts, redefining the links between business and your L&D metrics, and mapping for future talent in the marketplace. Learning and development in Ireland is evolving from a compliance-driven cost center initiative into a strategic growth lever. And this shift is uneven amongst our organizations. In 2025, that inconsistent budget and low return on investment measurement is a limiting impact, while the skills gap widens. So for 2026, HR and business leaders must lock in a stable investment, measure what matters, tie learning directly to performance, succession, and workforce planning. And organizations that conduct learning and development strategies to the business outcomes will outperform peers in innovation, retention, and productivity. I trust you find these data points insightful, and please use them to consider your organization's specific departments and wider for 2026 and beyond. I'm delighted to introduce Katie Ridge, the head of employee relations in our organization, who will be exploring performance management, retirement and pension, as well as working practices. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and indeed Michelle, and to our hosts. Good morning, everybody in the real capital. Our function today is to take our really insightful findings from our HR Barometer Series 9.2 and have a Munster lens, as it were. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules for what I think will be very practical takeaways. And hopefully, as the previous speakers have referenced, you'll be able to inform your decision making and indeed your investments in a very focused way. So as the previous speakers have touched on, in addition to some moderation in the economic growth forecast, so approximately it's gone to 2% from 2.9%, our series 9.2, which is the second one this year, points to challenges for Irish employers in dealing with some persistencies around labour shortages, together with tightening regulations and transparency requirements. And this is all against a backdrop of shifting employee expectations. My segue into the Barometer 9.2 is to look at the issues of performance management, retirement and pensions, auto-enrollment, and indeed work practices. So Performance management was determined by the participants in our survey as being number 4 in their top 5 strategic priorities. So certainly Ireland Inc. sees performance management as a significant aspect in terms of their agility and optimizing their goals. The slide in front of you indicates that 84% of organisations surveyed have a performance management process in place. And a bula bus in terms of Munster, because 89% of Munster-based participants have that in place. So very keenly aware of the benefits of performance management tools. And when we look at the type of performance management model for our respondents, we see that 49% of the businesses are maintaining a traditional rating system. 22% are using objectives and key results model. 15% have indicated they use a hybrid model, and 14% are using a rateless model. So a bit of variation there, albeit the traditional rating system holding out. And I think that that's interesting in terms of the diversity around most people doing performance management, but it being done in really a variety of ways, albeit traditional rating being the main way in which people are continuing to manage performance, excuse me, in their organisations. But isn't it interesting to see that in Munster, 39% versus 38% in other locations believe their performance management, excuse me, process is effective or very effective. So not even half of Irish businesses surveyed believe that they are getting the effective outcomes in relation to the whole task of performance management, which is big for everybody involved, the employee and indeed the line manager, and then feeding all of that data back into the organisation in terms of our goals and priorities for the next business year. So let's have a look at the next slide, which is focusing on some of the changes that are contemplated around performance management. 39% of our survey participants from Munster indicate that they intend changing their performance management process in the next 12 months. And nationally, that compares to 35% of businesses around the country. And they often say that the devil is in the detail, and I think that is very much the case in relation to how businesses are contemplating changing up their approach to performance management. So the granular detail breaks down in relation to changing processes along the following lines. 9% of Munster businesses surveyed said that they were going to look at more integrated learning and development focus as part of their performance management changes. And this compares to 22% in other parts of the country. In terms of a focus on continuous feedback and dialogue, Munster rated that in terms of 27% versus a otherwise countrywide 20%. Again, focus on personal and work goals were higher in terms of order of change. 27% of Munster businesses saw that as a significant change up in the process versus 18% around the rest of the country. Ongoing progress reviews with accountability and incentives fare less well, with 9% of Munster businesses saying that this is an element that they will change up. Data-driven performance analysis. 14% of businesses outside of Munster said that this would be an important element of change in how they address performance management. But it was something that mattered significantly more at 19% for those of you with your business in Munster. And finally, then, the agility and collaborative goals. Very little difference there, 8% around the country, with the exception of 9% in Munster. So it's very clear that as we are heading into 2026, performance management has to evolve from a compliance exercise to an agile, data-driven and indeed employee-centric performance management framework, because that is what is needed to foster engagement and indeed retention. So a couple of important takeaways I would suggest there in terms of those of you sitting around the table with the ability to influence change in this particular aspect of our greatest resource, which is our workforce. If we can turn then to the next slide, which is taking a different focus, and that is a focus on retirement and pensions. So I suppose the context in relation to this is significant, and we're seeing it in various discussions across the country in relation to macro policy, in relation to the provision of services. And really what I'm getting at is the ungetawayable from phenomenon of Ireland's ageing workforce. So the share of the population aged 65 years and over is set to steadily rise. Indeed, it's almost going to double from 15% recorded in 2022 to approximately 29% in 2070. So that's something that we are hearing, as I say, in general government policy. I'll be touching on auto enrolment now in a moment, but ageing within our society is clearly an issue that we are needing to see significant change in our approaches. And one big element of our societal activity is the workplace. So in the much shorter term, the next 24 months, the ageing workforce, together with pension reforms and indeed tightening labour markets, will challenge Ireland's workforce resilience. The Barometer shows 61% of respondents in Munster have a retirement age of 65 years, and this compares to 44% of businesses outside of Munster who have that contractual retirement age of 65. 7% of Munster organisations do not have a set retirement age, which compares with 12% in areas other than Munster. And in Munster, 39% of organisations permit employees to work beyond retirement age in, of course, certain circumstances. And this compares favourably with slightly less, 35% in the non-Munster area. I think it's also important to bring to the table that there is an employment contractual retirement bill going through the Oireachtas at the moment, and that will ultimately and soon, we expect in 2026, it will give employees the right to remain in their employment until the state pension age, which is presently at 66. And indeed, yesterday, there was more consolidation by the state around the pension age staying at 66, despite there being views that it would be increased to 67 or 68 years of age. So when this bill is enacted, that will effectively safeguard the legal right of individuals to stay in their role if they wish until they reach the pensionable age of 66 years. So that's something to be watchful for. If the contract says you must leave on hitting your 65th birthday, which is a very common phenomenon we've seen from our data, then once the bill is enacted, it is at the discretion of the contracted worker to determine if they wish to leave at 65 or if they wish to stay on until age 66, the current state pension accessibility age. It's also important to refer to the code of practice that we have in relation to longer working. And this has been a very significant tool in relation to workers looking to stay in the workforce beyond, indeed, their contractual retirement age. And this is separate now to any changes that the legislation will make in relation to being age 66 when typically leaving employment. It's apparent from more of the cases than less, if I can put it that way, that have been taken by complainants to the WRC and our Labour Court, that large numbers of those complainants have been successful in demonstrating that they were not given the necessary rights in relation to options around longer working. And most of those mistakes, it would be important to note, were procedural mistakes made by organisations. So that's something to be very cognizant of. It's also, I think, important in a smart economy to remember that we are talking about people who have a lot of learning, a lot of wisdom, and there is frequently no impediment to them, if they so wish, in staying on in whatever capacity works for both of those parts to the employment contract. So the businesses, really, I suppose the message is, the businesses that will succeed are those who invest early on in relation to succession and capability planning, and they link the retirement aspect directly to skill strategies. So let's then turn to topic of the final quarter of 2026, and that is auto enrolment. So if you've never heard of auto enrolment, I congratulate you, because you've managed to be out of the stratosphere in terms of it being the pervasive messaging of quarter four. In essence, this is a project that has been around for a very long time to address the shortfall for over 800,000 workers in Ireland who are not in a company pension scheme or have not access to PRSA. And this is also known as My Future Fund, and the state are pressing the commencement button on this on the 1st of January 2026. So it's really important that organisations know how to navigate themselves in a compliant way around the imminent introduction of auto enrolment. So doubling down on the data that we have in our Barometer 9.2, it is worrying to see that only 35% of organisations would agree around the country that they are very prepared for auto enrolment. That figure is less in Munster, just 29%. So probably some residual work to be done there in a variety of organisations. I think also in terms of comfort giving, the appointment of the agency to support the administration of auto enrolment, that has had wheels put under it in the last 6 to 8 weeks, and seems to be setting up for minimal extra work on businesses in relation to the necessity for you to auto enroll persons who are not presently in your pension scheme. My understanding is that if you have people outside of your pension scheme and they have not been enrolled by November, so this month's payroll, they will be deemed to be persons who will qualify for auto enrolment, subject to the parameters of earnings and age, etc. So we were asking a little earlier in the year, has the anticipated introduction of auto enrolment resulted in an intention to open a current occupational pension scheme to a higher number of employees? 43% in Munster indicated positively that they were contemplating that, I suppose, as a way in which they would address the requirement for bringing in excluded persons into some form of pension fund. And that relates positively in relation to a lower figure of 39% outside of the Munster area. 54% said no, that isn't something that they were contemplating, compared to 42% around the rest of the country. And only 3% hadn't really thought about it or determined they would go one way or another, whereas a worrying 19% around the rest of the country intimated that they didn't know what they were doing. It's very much now the time to know what you're doing and to have determined if it's access to the pension scheme or auto enrolment. And in terms of the cost per employee per annum to provide access to occupational pension schemes, you can see the breakdown there in relation to the percentages. So I think that at this juncture, businesses have taken firmer steps in relation to auto enrolment, and it looks like the extra work or indeed cost on employer is going to be mitigated somewhat by the national agency, who will be providing a lot of the underpinning in relation to the mechanics of auto enrolment. It will be very interesting to see how it unfolds as we move forward, particularly given the fact that people can opt out in month 7 or 8. I imagine we will have some interesting data in our Barometer Series 1 next year around the manifestation of auto enrolment. So in the remaining time, if I can just turn to my next slide, which is working practices. And this is something that has been on our agenda since we started our barometer, but has had, I think, more engagement, and it resonates more with businesses subsequent to the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, one of the big developments in that era was the issue of remote and indeed hybrid working. In relation to organisations that have hybrid working in place, 76% of the participants outside of Munster indicated that they have a hybrid working arrangement, and that compares with 57% of Munster respondents. So there's a significant, I suppose, reduction in terms of the practice of hybrid working in Munster, and it would be interesting to maybe get under the bonnet in different businesses to understand what the contributory factors are to that. We know that there are definitely movements nationwide in terms of people having more anchor days, and that is coming not only from the business requirements, but we are seeing increasingly that workers are very aware that they need to be able to upskill, they need to be able to get the apprenticing, if I can put it that way, in terms of learning by being exposed to more experienced and senior colleagues. And so there is an appetite there that perhaps wasn't there in our previous or more recent version of our barometer. The average number of days in the office has moved to 3 days in many instances, because organisations are seeking to secure culture, innovation, engagement, and indeed performance. 56% of you folks in Munster indicated that you believe that hybrid working has benefited your organisation in terms of productivity. And that's a bit less than the remainder of the country, which would have indicated 70% believing hybrid working benefited the organisation in terms of productivity. And if we look then in terms of the biggest challenges in relation to the current working model, so they would have been identified as team connection, management of employees, and engagement levels. For people outside of Munster, team connection was at 42%, just a tad above at 43%. For businesses in Munster, the management of employees was coming in at 40% for businesses with the exception of the Munster area, and significantly higher at 54% for those businesses who participated from the Munster region in our barometer. Levels of engagement, not so much of a stark difference. 32% identified that as you're in your top 3, whereas 35% in areas outside of Munster identified it as in their top 3. And if we finally turn then to what was determined as the initiatives, the top 3 of initiatives for continued hybrid working success, they were advised as increased communication, so 49% outside of Munster versus a 43% in the Munster region. Focusing employees on engagement initiatives, 37% of respondents, or 37% of businesses outside of Munster saw this as a significant top 3 initiative, and slightly less in Munster at 29%. And company culture initiatives coming in at 36% outside of Munster versus 25% in Munster. So the communications very much atop of the list in relation to Munster businesses. And that's probably no surprise in relation to the high value put on the challenge in relation to team connection in businesses in the Munster region. I hope that has been insightful for you, and I'd now like to pass over to my colleague Michelle McDonough in relation to her insights on inclusivity and diversity findings for our barometer. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much, Katie, and lots of interesting data there. I'm sure we could spend lots more time digging into that if we could, but hopefully it's given some great insights to our participants today. So we're going to move into a new space now, and I'm going to talk you through the updates from this latest barometer series on diversity and inclusion, and then we'll finish off with pay. So in the D&I space, it's something that we have seen has been very topical in recent months. It's been going through a bit of a change in terms of that influence we're having globally in discussions about. We know of some examples of companies that have either completely stopped funding or progressing on their initiatives that they had planned in D&I, or others have maybe sought to reframe it or perhaps reword it, or manage how their stakeholders are perceiving it. And that's been a frightening, I suppose, change that we saw coming very, very quickly. And then secondly, I think it forced HR professionals to think, okay, we know fundamentally this is still a critical area of importance. We know that it underpins so many other pieces of our values and our ethos and how we believe we want to behave or show up as a people-centric organization. So how are we going to maintain a commitment to that? So I noted when I was preparing for the session today, the change in language between, you'll see on the slide here, we asked people how many participants have a DEI policy in place. And that struck me straight away because, we talk about ED&I and now it's changing to DE&I being the conversation. So what's the difference between the two of those? So ED&I is that European lens we would be more familiar with, which is equality, diversity and inclusion. And that focuses on equal rights and opportunities for people. Whereas this DEI is, I think, coming from that global influence, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we see that in more corporate organizations globally. And that focuses more on systematic fairness and trying to focus on the basis or understanding that different people have different needs. So just a slight nuance there. And I think that just forces us all to step back from this space and think about, in that changing context of D&I, what do we in our organizations and in our context believe and see diversity and inclusion? What does it mean for us? What are our goals or objectives in this space? How does it fit into our EVP, and how do we want to show up as employers in this space? And that has to be the first conversation, and perhaps it needs to be a revised conversation because of that changing context globally. And before we can achieve any success, we know we have to have clarity in that purpose. So perhaps that's the first step, to have those conversations again. But interesting that we are seeing increases in those organizations having DEI policies compared to last year. So we see that's been gone from 63 to 68 and now 76, and in Munster that's similar figure at 75. So that's positive, and perhaps that is indicative that organizations are having those conversations in terms of understanding their purpose and what framework they're setting out to achieve on a formal footing. Of course, we know for us to feel the real benefit of those initiatives, we need to be able to cascade that down into practice. And this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky. So when we look across the slide here, we see that in 2025, we have planned to deliver, we have delivered 21% of D&I training over the course of the year, and that compares to 29% last year. And that compares to 29% that we're estimating we will deliver next year in 2026. So where that's concerning for me is that when we look back on our previous data nationally and in the Munster region, we see that those figures were much higher. So in previous reports last year, we were looking at pretty much 50-50. So 51% of organisations were planning to deliver training, and now that's dropped in the Munster region to 21 this year, and staying well below the 50 at 29 for next year. And what that indicates is there's going to be a gap between our intent on those policy crafting and those conversations around purpose and our practice and how we're cascading that down, because we know one of the first steps in diversity and inclusion is about building awareness and training and having conversations around what does this mean for us and how are we going to implement this, our initiatives or our objectives within our own organization. So that's something I would suggest take a stop, pause and think about, because we know that it's very easy for us to just keep moving forward and then suddenly be disappointed that we're not getting the outputs that we anticipated, or the ROI is being challenged at your senior meetings. So we have to make sure that there's alignment between our policy, our formal structures, and our implementation and how we're supporting those initiatives, so that we can ensure that dot connect between intention and practice. And of course, measurement. What are we trying to measure and how are we going to know whether we've been successful or not? One of the other questions we asked the survey participants was, what were the top 3 initiatives that organizations have introduced to address gender balance? And this is most likely coming from the fact that we've done gender pay gap reporting for a number of years. So perhaps those organizations that have been implementing changes, and interesting to just learn from them to see what they have found has been their most focused area. And that's come out at inclusive recruitment drives being number 1 at 75%, embedding D&I into talent acquisition strategies at 50%, and increased flexible workplace practices at 50%. So I think this comes with an intention that if we bring more females perhaps into the organization, and we're just challenging ourselves to think, which is a very progressive thing to do in terms of maybe gender-based panels or blind resume screening, and trying to get to a point where we're making those decisions that enable females in particular to have a better opportunity to come into our organizations at different levels. So even we've seen, I think one of the most common things I've seen in job advertisements is around, if you feel you fit the majority of criteria in this application, please apply. So we're just supporting people to not feel they need to tick every single box before they submit that application. And that has resulted in some positive impacts. So that's been a good change to see. And then looking at gender pay gap in a little bit more detail, we're always keen to get a sense of the benchmarks and the numbers around this space. And we've seen fluctuation in it over the time period. We know our formal data in Ireland is really, our last CSO data is quite old now at this point, 2022, and that came out at 9.6%. So that's our that's one of the key metrics we look at when we benchmark our own individual organizations against. But in our HR Barometer, we've been asking participants for a number of years what they anticipate their gender pay gap figures will be. And we see that started at 9.4% in 2022, dropped in 2023, perhaps because of some of those recruitment practices and changes to our talent acquisition, and it rose again in 2024 to 10.7. And I thought it was interesting nationally that we're seeing 7.7% anticipated for 2025, which I actually feel is quite low. And nationally, I would be surprised, I have to say, if that was born to be true, based on, obviously we're doing a lot of space work in this area in Adare this year, so it's not reflective of the figures that I'm seeing nationally. So then I thought it was interesting that the Munster data came out at 10.6%, which is probably a bit more reflective of where we're at. And that is compared against the latest Eurostat data from 2023, which gives 12% as the EU average GPG or gender pay gap figure, and Ireland is coming in just below the 10% mark on that. In terms of our contribution to that overall figure. So yeah, interesting to see how it fluctuates, but it's really important ultimately for you to be looking at where your data points are in comparison to some of those reference points. And obviously the real focus of gender pay gap is really about the storytelling of what initiatives you're going to come up with to try and keep your gap coming down. And as we know, we're all really being led by the EU Transparency Directive and its transposition next year, and that sets the bar at 5% of unexplained gaps. So if we look at organisations that are legally obliged to record their gender pay gaps, we see that 64% in the Munster region. Last survey, that was 30% in Munster. Again, not surprising because of the change in the scale. And we know organisations now this year for the first time that are 50 employees or more are obligated to report their gender pay gap. So that's probably why that's jumped so much. And the voluntary has gone down, where it was 15% is now 4%. So that's likely related to that. Looking at gender balance and pay transparency, we asked what are the top 3 pay transparency related metrics currently being tracked in your organization? And 65% was gender pay gap. if I report the Munster data, 100% was gender pay gap, 50% was pay ranges by job category, and 50% justification of pay levels. And these are all things that we know are required by pay transparency. So it's quite progressive to see that, half of your organizations are thinking in that way and are already starting to prepare for that. 8.6 nationally or 7.1 in Munster have developed or updated internal policy practices on pay transparency, job evaluation or pay equity auditing in the last 12 months. So maybe we're starting to look at some of those areas in a practical sense in terms of job categories, but we're not quite there in terms of our full processes yet, because that is still a low figure. We are going to have to get much more proactive in this space because it's coming at us thick and fast. And it's quite a significant piece of work that needs to be done in a lot of our organizations, because I would say majority of Irish organizations are behind the curve in actually having clarity in their reward structures and being able to stand up to scrutiny. And we really do need to get more proactive and engaged around that topic. 43% of organizations are tracking pay equity for DEI purposes, which again is actually, I think, quite a positive figure, because it is pay equity is a step further beyond just doing gender pay gaps. You're really trying to identify your outliers and then your action points for improving those things in the future. Our biggest challenges that we asked our participants around pay transparency requirements came out as 36% a lack of internal expertise. And that's borne true from our experience of working with clients as well, as they've come to realize that actually this is quite a complex space and is a lot more difficult than was anticipated. So there's that challenge between skill, experience, because it is new legislation. A lot of people haven't come across it before, or just time pressures to actually get it done. So 36% and 25% system limitations, and that's around the complexity of pulling data from different payroll systems. And then 14% that cultural resistance. So there's a bit of fear, I suppose, of when we do objective analysis of our pay, what's it going to tell us? And is that suddenly going to increase our costs? And we know that's in the context of there being a lot of pressures on businesses from a cost perspective as well. And then finally, I'll just close off with our last section around pay. And that is obviously a key data point for you to get a sense of. So our pay anticipated increases for 2025 came in at 3.6%, and the actual has come in at 3.2% nationally, but in Munster region we see that at 3.5%. 38% are citing those increases will be unilaterally applied, and 21% citing performance-based. I thought it was interesting that the Munster data is quite different here to the national data. So the Munster data is telling me 47% are using performance-based pay, which is quite a bit higher than the national data. And I think that's quite a positive trend. So we're really seeing that we need to do more with what we have and make sure that we are optimizing our organizations, and we're giving that clarity around what's expected from people, and we're managing that performance and we're linking that to the pay so that we can support our organizations to be stronger. And of course that in turn will impact our affordability and our profitability as well. And then finally, we see that 66% are planning to increase their salaries in 2026 by 3.1%. And traditionally, we've seen what people anticipate the increase is slightly higher than what they actually increase by. So that might just guide you a little bit in that Munster anticipating 3.2%, that might end up coming in slightly less when we ask in our next survey what their figures actually were. And in the Munster region, 75% planning to give those increases. One of the other areas we wanted to ask was intention to change their pay model in the next 12 months because of some of those factors around EU pay transparency and the challenges that it poses. And we see that 14% are planning to change their model. In 2025, the participants have told us that in the next 12 months, 14% are planning to change their models. And I think that's around some of the stuff we talked about there, around pay for performance, and continually experimenting with those pieces around skill-based pay, flexible rewards, and making sure that we're optimizing our reward structures. The rationale for the changes are coming in at 29.6% the Pay Transparency Directive, 22.2% retention of employees, and 25% in Munster, the current pay model not being sustainable. And that may be because we've identified red flags or red circle people, or because we just don't have enough solid objective justification around our pay structures. So that takes you through our data from our HR Barometer survey. I hope you've gotten some good insights from what we've shared across with you. And I think there's a theme for me across the whole report is that, the key areas of focus are clarity in org design, and performance that links in then to managing performance and supporting it through strong learning and development. And we know the whole area of reward and auto enrollment and all the pieces that come with reward and our reward structures are such a fundamental requirement for us to be proactive in and to push forward in for the rest of this year and into 2026. And all of that underpinned by very clear metrics around what we anticipate we can change, and making sure that before we make any investments in those areas, we're clear on our purpose, what we want to achieve, and what our outcomes are anticipated to be, so that we can report on our delivery after that. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to Niamh just to close out the session for us.
Thanks very much, Michelle, Amanda, and Katie. That was really interesting, and there is an obvious reason why lots of companies are planning on increasing their HR teams next year, because if you look just at the breadth of activity, even just this morning, in terms of the work that's required to get up to speed on everything, it is massive, and I know you're great to help your clients also with all these things. Just if anyone does have any questions, you can still pop them in the chat box and we can come back to you directly, or obviously feel free to email as well, and we can pass them on to the team at Adare to help you out. Adare, again, thanks so much for this valuable partnership. It's always really, really insightful, and we really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks to everyone that joined us this morning as well, and we'll be in touch again regarding the next one, and have an absolutely fantastic day. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Take care.